You know the sound a flatbed winch makes when it's pulling a dead machine onto the trailer? It's not a grinding or a clanking. It's a low, steady whine, almost polite, like it's apologizing for what's happening. That's the sound that woke Terry up on a Tuesday in October 1981. He stood on his porch and watched the green John Deere 4640 roll silently up the ramps, its engine cold, its tires leaving clean tracks in the dust. The banker didn't even shut the cab door. He just chained it down and drove away, leaving behind a silence so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out of the county. That same morning, 300 yards down the gravel road, Terry poured ether into the intake of his 1976 International 1066. He hit the starter, and the machine responded with violence. A sharp, chemical crack echoed off the machine shed, followed by a dry, metallic heave that shook the ground under his boots. Then came the smoke, thick, black, smelling of unburnt fuel, as the DT-414 caught a cylinder, then another, settling into that heavy, bone-rattling idle that loosened your fillings and announced to every creditor in earshot, "This iron still runs, and nobody owns it but me." In the 1980s farm crisis, silence was bankruptcy. Noise was solvency. We're going to look at how a machine that destroyed a man's hearing actually saved his farm, and how the quiet comfort of a modern cab hid the screaming reality of debt. The engine is warm now, the idle smoothing out. But the year isn't 2024. It's 1978, and the trouble is just getting started. They called it the fever, and if you were farming in the late 70s, you felt the heat rising from the soil itself. Corn was gold, beans were diamonds, and land prices were climbing a ladder that didn't seem to have a top. You could walk into a bank with dirt under your fingernails and walk out with $250,000, just on a handshake and a promise. The bankers weren't checking equity. They were handing out rope. Terry lived next to a man named Gary. Big Gary. Gary was the poster child for the Department of Agriculture's favorite slogan, "Get big or get out." And Gary was getting big. He tore down his fences to make mile-long rows. He bulldozed the windbreaks. And in the spring of '78, he brought home the crown jewel. It was a brand new John Deere 4640. You have to understand what that machine meant back then. It wasn't just a tractor. It was a spaceship. It had the sound guard body, a curved glass quiet zone where you could listen to the radio without headphones. It had the quad-range transmission, air conditioning that actually worked, and a seat that floated on air. Gary sat in there like a king, insulated from the dust, the heat, and the noise of the world. He financed every dime of it on a floating rate note, because the banker told him that inflation would pay off the debt for him. Leverage, they called it. Smart money. Terry went a different way. That same week, he drove his flatbed truck 2 counties over to a jockey lot. He traded in 2 worn-out Farmall M's and a stack of cash he'd been hiding in a coffee can for a used 1976 International 1066, the black stripe model. It was a brute. No sound guard body here, just a steel canopy, fenders, and the open air. It had the DT-414 turbo diesel engine, a power plant that pulled like a freight train but drank fuel like a sailor. It had a heavy clutch that required 40 pounds of pressure to disengage, the kind that gives you a limp by the time you're 50. It leaked a little oil from the PTO seal. It smoked when you lugged it. But when Terry handed over the cash, the dealer handed him the title. The banker, a man named Mr. Henderson, who wore loafers that had never touched manure, called Terry into his office the next day. He laid out a spreadsheet, tapping his pen on the tax shield column. "Terry," he said, using the tone reserved for a slow child, "you're running a business, not a museum. You need write-offs. You need efficiency. That old binder is going to beat you to death. Gary is leveraging his assets to maximize yield. You're letting your capital sit idle." Terry just looked at him, adjusting his cap. "Mr. Henderson," he said, "I can fix a clutch. I can rebuild a TA. But I can't fix a payment that eats more than the crop makes. Rust sleeps. Interest doesn't." Gary laughed when he saw the 1066 chugging down the lane, black smoke rolling out of the chrome stack. He waved from his air-conditioned cab, wearing a clean polo shirt, looking fresh at 5 p.m. Terry waved back, wiped the grease off his forehead, and put the tractor in gear. The torque amplifier whined. The engine roared, and the vibration started up his spine. It was uncomfortable. It was loud. It was utterly obsolete. But as he dropped the plow into the earth, Terry knew one thing the banker didn't. He owned the iron. The bank owned Gary. And in farming, the only thing that matters is who holds the deed when the music stops. To understand why Terry survived, you have to look past the sheet metal and understand the mechanical soul of the machine he bet his life on. The International 1066 isn't a tractor you drive, it's a tractor you survive. At its heart sits the DT414 engine, a 400 series, wet-sleeve diesel that is widely regarded as one of the best power plants ever bolted into a frame rails. It doesn't just run, it hammers. When the turbo spools up, it produces a high-pitched whistle that cuts right through your earplugs, a sound that says it's burning fuel and making torque. It has a torque rise that refuses to quit, meaning when the plow hits a clay vein and the RPMs drop, the engine just digs in and grunts harder. It doesn't stall. It gets angry. But that power came with a physical tax. We call it the international leg. See, the clutch on a 1066 isn't hydraulic. It's a mechanical linkage fighting a massive pressure plate. Every time you turn around at the headland, you are leg pressing 40 pounds of resistance. Do that 300 times a day, 7 days a week, and your left knee starts to feel like it's full of gravel. The shift levers, located on the right console, were another test of character. Over time, the linkage wears out. If you aren't careful, if you try to speed shift it like a race car, you can jam the transmission into 2 gears at once. Then you're stuck in the field with a locked rear end, pulling the floor plate up to pry the shift rails back into neutral with a crowbar. To the neighbors, these were flaws. To Terry, they were just characteristics. He knew the machine had birth defects, specifically the torque amplifier, or TA. It's a planetary gear unit that allows you to downshift on the fly without clutching. In the 66 series, if you let it freewheel downhill or ran it low on fluid, the TA would grenade itself, sending shrapnel through the transmission. It was a weak point. But Terry treated it like a loaded gun, with respect. He knew the variables. That's why his mornings looked different than Gary's. Before the sun cracked the horizon, Terry was already in the shed with a flashlight. He wasn't just checking the oil, he was checking the coolant conditioner strips. On a wet sleeve engine, if the acidity gets off, the cylinder liners vibrate until they cavitate, literally pitting the metal from the inside out until water dumps into the oil. Terry knew this. He greased the wide front pivot pin every single day. He drained the water separator religiously. It was an intimacy, born of necessity. If that tractor stopped, his income stopped. Compare that to Gary. Gary's morning routine involved coffee and a phone call. If a warning light flickered on the dashboard of his 4640, he didn't pop the hood. He called the dealership. A service truck with a crane would roll out, and a technician in a clean uniform would plug in a diagnostic tool. Gary didn't know where the hydraulic filters were because the dealer manages the service schedule. He surrendered control for convenience. He traded the grease under his fingernails for a line item on a bill he wouldn't look at until harvest. This established the baseline for the war to come. Terry ended his days exhausted, his ears ringing, his left knee throbbing, smelling like diesel smoke and gear lube. But his operating cost was fuel, filters, and his own cartilage. Gary ended his days fresh, stepping out of a cab that smelled like air freshener and upholstery. He had zero physical fatigue, but he had a payment schedule that required a bumper crop every single year just to break even. Terry ended his days exhausted, his left knee throbbing and his ears ringing. But his operating cost was just fuel and his own cartilage. Gary ended his days fresh, but he was about to find out that the economy was going to be a lot harder on the wallet than that 1066 was on the body. Then the calendar turned and the world broke. It didn't happen with a bang or a crash, but with a press conference in Washington, D.C. On a Saturday night in October 1979, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker decided to break the back of inflation. He restricted the money supply. The prime rate didn't just climb, it jumped. It went from 11% to 15%, then 18%, and finally touched 21.5% by December of 1980. In the countryside, the fever broke, and a cold sweat set in. You could feel the temperature drop at the local coffee shop. For years, the liar's table in the corner had been loud with talk of yield monitors, new combines, and land acquisitions. Men slammed their fists on the Formica, bragging about how much they'd borrowed to buy the neighbor's 80. But by the spring of 81, the diner was quiet. The clatter of silverware on ceramic plates sounded like gunshots. Men stared into their coffee cups. The killer wasn't the debt itself. It was the terms. Men like Gary had signed variable rate notes. The banker had sold it as a flexibility tool, a way to ride the market. It was actually a trap door. Gary's payment on that John Deere 4640 didn't stay flat. When the prime rate doubled, his interest payment doubled. Suddenly, the tractor wasn't just costing him principal, it was eating equity. At the same time, the grain markets collapsed. Corn, that had been $3 a bushel, fell to $1.50. Gary was caught in a pincer movement. He needed $4 corn to service a 20% note, and the market was giving him pennies. Even worse, the asset value of his machinery plummeted. That spaceship 4640, the one he owed $80,000 on, it was now worth $50 on the open market. He was underwater. He was driving a machine that was technically insolvent every time he turned the key. Terry felt the pinch too. Low commodity prices don't care if you're debt-free. They hurt everyone. The diesel for the 1066 still cost money. The seed corn still cost money. But when the harvest check came in light, Terry didn't have a banker waiting in the lobby. He could park the 1066 in the shed, shut the door, and it wouldn't cost him a dime. It sat there, ugly and paid for, a hunk of cast iron that demanded nothing but space. Its obsolescence was its armor, a machine without a payment book. The neighborhood began to fracture. The first auction sale bill went up at the post office in late '81. It wasn't a retirement sale. It was a forced liquidation. And what was the first thing listed? The shiny paint. The big, comfortable, air-conditioned tractors were the first to go because they were the only things with enough value to satisfy the lien holders. Gary stopped waving when he drove past. He looked tired, his face gray behind the sound guard glass. The cab was still quiet, but the noise in his head must have been deafening. Terry watched the green tractor work the fence line and felt a grim sense of security. He thought he had built a fortress out of paid-for iron. He thought that because he owed no man anything, he was untouchable. He was wrong. Economics is one thing, but physics is another. Terry thought he was safe because he owed no man a dime. He thought his paid-for iron was his fortress. But economics is one thing, and physics is another. And the 1066 was about to remind him that iron doesn't care about your bank balance. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that feels heavy before the sky even turns gray. The barometer was dropping. You could feel it in your sinuses, and the local AM radio was predicting a 3-day soaker coming up from the Gulf. Terry was in the back 40, a piece of ground known for clay so stiff it could pull the boots right off your feet. He was pulling a 13-shank chisel plow, burying it deep to break up the hardpan. The 1066 was earning its keep. The turbo was screaming that high-pitched whistle, the pyrometer needle was climbing, and the exhaust stack was painting a black streak across the clouds. He hit a vein of blue clay. The engine lugged down, the RPMs dropping from 2,400 to 1,800. Instinctively, Terry reached for the torque amplifier lever on the left side of the steering column. He pulled it back into low range to get that extra grunt without shifting gears. Usually, the TA engages with a firm, mechanical thud, dropping the speed and boosting the torque. Not this time. When he pulled the lever, the tractor didn't dig in. It let go. The engine revved free, screaming against the governor, while the forward momentum died instantly. The chisel plow acted like an anchor, jerking the machine to a halt. Then, with a sickening clunk, the mechanical sprag clutch tried to catch, slipped, and grabbed again. A sound like a bucket of bolts in a blender erupted from the transmission housing. Smoke, acrid and blue, puffed out from the breather tube. The tractor shuddered violently and stopped. Terry killed the engine. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ticking of cooling iron and the distant rumble of thunder. He climbed down and put his hand on the transmission case. It was hot, hotter than it should be. He could smell it before he even pulled the dipstick. The distinct, nauseating scent of burnt Hytran fluid. It smells like sulfur and dead money. He walked back to the house to use the phone. He called the dealership, asking for a remanufactured TA unit. The parts manager, a guy who had never busted a knuckle in his life, sighed. "Terry, that's a big job. We're 2 weeks out on shop work. But listen, we've got a lease program running. I can have a 4440 out there by noon tomorrow. Low hours, power shift. You sign the paper, we drop it off, and you finish your harvest before the rain hits. We'll worry about the trade-in later." It was the siren song of the easy way out. Outside, the wind was picking up. His crop was vulnerable. His back was already spasming from the clutch pedal. A lease meant he could sleep tonight. A lease meant he didn't have to fight the iron. Terry looked at his hands, stained with the grease of 1,000 repairs. He looked at the calendar on the wall, marked with the dates of the 1930s Dust Bowl his father had survived. "No," he said into the receiver. "Just order the parts. I'll pick them up in the morning." He dragged the dead 1066 into the shed with the old grain truck. That night, the real work began. Splitting a tractor is violent surgery. You have to separate the engine from the transmission, literally breaking the machine in half. It's a job for a gantry crane and a concrete floor. But Terry had a bottle jack, a stack of railroad ties, and a chain hoist looped over a rafter. He spent the next hour blocking up the front half of the tractor, driving wooden wedges between the front axle and the frame to keep the engine from flopping over. He unbolted the frame rails, the hydraulic lines, the steering linkage. Then, with the transmission supported on a rolling floor jack, he carefully pried the two halves apart. The tractor split like an egg. The TA housing sat inside the center section, a heavy, oil-slicked drum of gears and clutches. When he pulled it out, the damage was visceral. The fiber discs were stripped bare, and the ramp and roller clutch was shattered. The housing was filled with metal shavings that looked like glitter in the beam of his flashlight. For the next 2 days, Terry didn't sleep. He rebuilt the unit on a workbench covered in cardboard. This wasn't just swapping parts. It was precision engineering performed in a barn. He had to shim the bearings to within 0.003 of an inch. Too tight, and it would burn up in an hour. Too loose, and it would hammer itself to death. He worked by the light of a Coleman lantern when the storm finally hit and knocked out the power. He could hear the rain hammering the tin roof, a relentless drumbeat reminding him of the time he was losing. He soaked the new clutch packs in fresh fluid. He measured the end-play with a dial indicator, his hands steady despite the fatigue. He was fighting the machine, yes, but he was also fighting the bank. Every bolt he tightened was $1 he didn't borrow. Every hour he sweated was interest he didn't pay. On the third morning, the storm broke. The air was crisp and cold. Terry rolled the two halves of the tractor back together, lining up the splines with a patience that bordered on prayer. He bolted it tight, refilled the hydraulic system with fresh fluid, and climbed into the seat. He turned the key. The DT-414 fired to life. He let it warm up, then pulled the TA lever back. The tractor slowed, the torque increased, and the unit held. No slip, no scream. He had fixed it with $400 in parts and 3 days of hell. Terry had fixed his problem with $400 in parts and 3 days of hell. He had beaten the machine. But across the fence, Gary was facing a breakdown that a wrench couldn't touch. While Terry was torquing the last bolt on the 1066, Gary was staring at a dashboard light. It wasn't a catastrophic noise like the TA failure. It was a polite amber warning light, a transmission pressure sensor. On a John Deere 4640, that sensor speaks to a solenoid, and if the voltage varies by a fraction, the computer makes an executive decision. It shifts the transmission into neutral to protect the clutch packs. The tractor didn't break physically. It simply decided to stop working. Gary opened the side panel, expecting to see a loose linkage. Instead, he saw a loom of color-coded wires wrapped in black plastic. He saw sealed relay boxes. He wiggled a wire. Nothing happened. He kicked the tire. Nothing happened. He was locked out of his own machine by a safety protocol designed by an engineer 500 miles away. He called the dealership. The service manager didn't say, "We'll be there tomorrow." He said, "Gary, I can't get a tech out there until Thursday." Thursday was 3 days away. The forecast called for a hard freeze. "Why?" Gary asked. "I bought the service plan." The answer was the death knell of the 1980s farmer. "We're backed up. We aren't doing field calls. We're pulling tractors for the bank. I've got 3 trucks running 20 hours a day, just hauling iron back to the lot." The dealership wasn't fixing tractors. They were repossessing them. So Gary waited. He sat on his porch, watching the heavy gray clouds build, and he listened. Across the fence, a sound cut through the humid air. Whir, chug, chug, whir. It was the 1066. Terry had it back together. It was ugly. It was missing a side panel. The cab was just a steel umbrella vibrating in the wind, but it was moving. Terry was in the seat, his left leg burning from the clutch, his ears ringing from the straight pipe, dragging that chisel plow through the mud. He was miserable, physically broken, and covered in oil. But he was farming. Gary had the superior machine. He had the air conditioning. He had the power shift. He was a passenger in his own business, waiting for a permission slip from a mechanic he couldn't afford. On Wednesday morning, a truck turned into Gary's lane. Gary stood up, relief washing over him. He walked out to meet them, hand extended. But the man who stepped out wasn't wearing a mechanic's uniform. He was wearing a suit. And the truck wasn't a service body. It was a lowboy flatbed with a winch. The banker had beat the mechanic. The note was 90 days past due. Gary watched, helpless, as the man hooked a chain to the front axle of the 4640. The tractor, still stuck in neutral because of a $10 sensor, rolled easily onto the trailer. It was a silent, dignified exit for a machine that had never really been his. The efficiency, the tack shields, the leverage, it all rolled up the ramp and was chained down. Terry saw it happen from the headland. He pulled the throttle back, letting the 1066 idle down. He didn't smile. There is no victory in watching a neighbor fall. He just watched the green paint disappear down the road, heading for an auction block where it would sell for pennies on the dollar. He looked down at his own dashboard. No lights, no sensors, just gauges that jittered with the vibration. The seat was torn. The fenders were rusted. But the title was in a fireproof box under his bed. The green tractor left the county. The 4640 was gone, its comfort repossessed by the math that birthed it. But the 1066 stayed. It stayed scarred, rebuilt, and loud. And the next spring, when the snow melted, it was that old, smoke-belching International that plowed the earth that now belonged to the bank next door. The green tractor left the county, but the 1066 stayed. It stayed through the rest of the 80s, through the turn of the century, and into a world that forgot what a wrench was for. Fast forward 40 years, and that red paint isn't just color anymore. It's a record of survival. The sun is setting on a different century now. The International 1066 is still sitting in the machine shed, parked in the same spot where it was split in two during the Reagan administration. The black stripe decals are peeling, baked white by 4 decades of UV rays. The red paint has oxidized into a flat, chalky rust color that feels like sandpaper to the touch. The hour meter on the tachometer reads 2,400 hours, but that's a lie. It rolled over at 10,000 hours back in 1993 and again in 2008. It has buried 3 farm dogs, outlived 2 wives, and seen 5 different bank presidents come and go. Terry is still here too, though he moves slower now. He walks with a distinct hitch in his stride, the international limp, trading cartilage for torque every time you press that heavy clutch. He wears hearing aids now. The high frequency's gone since '89, but he can still hear a dry bearing from 50 yards away. The machine took his hearing and his knee, but it gave him the deed to the land. When you look at the county plat map today, the names have changed. Big Gary's land isn't Gary's anymore. It's owned by an investment group from Chicago. They lease it out to a management company that runs 400 horsepower tractors guided by satellites. The operators are 20-year-old kids who sit in cabs that are quieter than a library, staring at iPads, completely disconnected from the soil they are compacting. They don't know where the wet spots are. They don't know the history of the fence rows. They are just driving assets for a portfolio. But Terry's square on the map still has his name on it. It's an island of solvency in a sea of leveraged speculation. And that old 1066 is the reason why. True reliability isn't a machine that never breaks. It's a machine you can fix when it does. The bank wants you to buy what you can't afford, so they can own what you produce. They sell you comfort, efficiency, and tax write-offs. They want you in a sealed cab, unable to touch the mechanism, dependent on a service truck that charges $150 an hour just to show up. That is the definition of slavery in the modern age. The mechanic, however, buys what he can understand. He buys the machine that has an open frame, mechanical linkages, and parts you can buy at a truck stop. He accepts the noise. He accepts the vibration. He accepts the grease under his fingernails. Because he knows that when the economy crashes, or the part supply chain breaks, or the dealer goes under, he can still go to the barn, weld the broken steel, and put a crop in the ground. The 1066 wasn't just a tractor. It was a declaration of independence, cast in iron. Terry walks past the massive, silent, green machines parked in the neighbor's field. Machines that are currently waiting on a software update to run. He pats the warm hood of the 1066. It smells of diesel and dust, the perfume of survival. He didn't get rich. He didn't get comfortable. But he got to keep the farm. The engine shuts down one last time, the silence now peaceful, not terrifying. Terry rests his hand on the steering wheel, feeling the vibration fade into the cool evening air. So I have to ask, are you driving your life, or is the bank just letting you borrow the steering wheel? Subscribe if you want to keep the iron and let the debt walk. Because in the end, the only thing you truly own is what you can fix yourself.